Welcome everyone to the Nustar and Cyber Risk Management Group webinar on why organizations will be rushing to protect against DDoS. Before we begin, I want to go through some housekeeping tips for everyone. If you could click next. Today's session will be 45 minutes with 40 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. And as we go along and we're speaking, please submit your questions to the Q&A panel on the Zoom console. And we will be sending everyone a copy of the recording and slides to all attendees post the webinar. I'm Todd Wade. I am a principal consultant at the Cyber Risk Management Group, and I will be moderating today's webinar. First up, I would like to introduce you to our two speakers today. First is Nick Frost, who is the co-founder and director of the Cyber Risk Management Group. I'm going to hand it over to Nick so he can give you a brief intro of himself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Todd. And thank you and welcome to this really important presentation. I think we're going to hear a number of changes, I suppose you could say, around DDoS that I think most organizations are not really privy to. A bit of background about me. I'm one of the directors at CRMG, Cyber Risk Management Group. Held a number of senior roles in cybersecurity, the last one being head of information risk for PwC for the group. And that's me.
Great. Thank you for that, Nick. Now I'd like to introduce you to Michael Cosmarek, the Vice President of Product at Nustar. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Todd. Michael Cosmarek. I am head of product for our security solutions organization at Nustar. A little bit of background on me. I have been working in the internet industry for over 20 years and have been primarily working in cybersecurity for nearly a decade now, focusing in the areas of DNS, DDoS, and application security, as well as threat intelligence.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Michael. So for today's webinar, we're going to start. Michael's going to go ahead and give the first part, and then we'll carry on with Nick with his insight after that. So Michael, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to cover are some cyber trends that we're seeing, and primarily those things we're seeing during this pandemic that we're all experiencing. If you could hit the next slide, please. And it starts off with a basic question. Is DDoS still a thing? There are a number of times, I can't even count the amount of times we hear from people even asking the question, DDoS, it's been around for so long. Do you still even have to worry about it? Is this still something that exists? Do people even still conduct or have to protect themselves against DDoS attacks? Well, the interesting thing is yes. When you look at the data from 2019 in comparison with 2018, from attacks that we've seen and mitigated across our infrastructure, the number of attacks have gone up 180%. And that's a significant number when you're looking at trends and looking at data historically of DDoS attacks. In addition, the largest attack we saw this year was, or I should say in 2019, was around 587 gigabits per second. That was 31% larger than the largest attack we had seen in 2018. And when you look at the most intense attacks, and this means not just volumetric in the amount of bandwidth it would consume, but the number of packets per second that are flooding the applications. That attack was 252% higher than what we had seen in 2018. And so our largest attack, or our largest or most intense attack in 2019 was 343 million packets per second, which is a pretty outstanding number. Next slide. Some of the trends we had seen, one of the most interesting thing was the fact that beyond just seeing increases in large attacks, those above 50 gigs and 100 gigs per second, which typically you would expect, we saw a significant increase in small attacks that were 5 gigabits per second and below. These are the types of attacks that tend to fly under the radar. Most organizations don't set thresholds to be able to detect these types of attacks. Plus, they're also quick hitting. So when they come in, they will immediately do some damage. You'll notice a blip. You won't recognize if it's going to be an issue or not. And by the time you're ready to go through and deal with it, it's gone. But then you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what happened in the situation. So next slide. And what we've noticed from over the years is that when you compare 2018 to 2019, the bad actors are using more and more threat vectors to basically figure out how they can become successful in taking you down or taking your applications down. In 2019, we saw an increase in the number of attacks that used 2 or more threat vectors, and it was a total of 85%. And why this is a little worrisome is that the attackers are getting smarter. They continue to try new things. They continue to look for new ways to be able to gain an advantage. And as a result, they may find something, they may stick with it, but if they realize that you've actually put a countermeasure in place, they will then go and move on to the next tactic. So you're continuously having to ensure that your protections are smarter, that your protections are continuously being or able to adapt to the changes that are happening, because any misstep could give them an advantage where they could gain access or, in essence, fulfill what they're trying, what their overall intended purpose was in the first place. Next slide, please. So what's interesting is when you go back, compare 2018 to 2019, and you see that the trends are showing that DDoS attacks are becoming more prevalent. Attackers are trying different tactics. We're seeing an increase in smaller attacks that are occurring on infrastructures. But now we're in this new reality. We're now under a pandemic. We're now in a situation where, if you can go to the next slide, where travel is down, where lockdowns are up, where most organizations are having to work from home. You're no longer visiting your customers face-to-face in the office. You're dealing with them over video conferencing or through video chats, or doing a lot of work over email or through the phone. Anything that is preventing you from doing what you've done in the past, what was considered normal business. And now what's interesting is while lockdowns are up, the next slide, so is the threat of attack. So the Nustar Internet Security Council is a group of about 300 companies and organizations worldwide that we survey, that provides feedback on various types of questions around cybersecurity. One of the interesting statistics when you look at this chart is when you look at what they say in the current period with respect to the threat of attack and what they perceive as the most likely areas or places where an attack would come from. The numbers haven't shifted much the order hasn't shifted much. Criminals and unknown actors are primarily where they expect the biggest threats to come from. What's interesting about this data, though, is that their perception of these, or where they most likely expect to see attacks come from, has increased almost 10% in these areas. So in the case when you look at the previous 17 months to where you look at it now, you see that they're more worried about every one of these vectors, that threats could come from criminals, competitors, outsiders, nation states, etc., more so than they were in prior periods. Next slide. And this is also the same case with respect to the changing threat landscape. Beyond just looking at who could be potentially causing the threat or where the threat could come from, there's more worried that the threat could be coming from the world at large, within their country, their industry. It just shows that during this time, there is a much more heightened awareness that the threat landscape has changed and has potentially gotten worse. Next slide. And what's interesting is that it makes sense when you kind of align these two things, because your organization has changed, your business has changed. You have to do business online if you're going to even conduct business. You know that meeting face to face and the manners in which you were doing things in the past has been thrown out the window. Possibly even your disaster recovery playbooks are all going through rewrites. You're now learning how, companies have to have learned how to work in this new environment, which has driven a massive shift in the way the internet is being used. And these two charts give a good description of that. When you look at websites, the traffic to websites after the first US COVID death, you see that from that period in, I would say, early March, massive increase in traffic online to most popular websites. So Facebook, Netflix, YouTube. But then also workers are starting to use more and more messaging software to communicate. They know that they're in lockdown. They know they're going to have to do work. They're unable to meet face-to-face, go into the boardroom or meeting room and hash an issue out. So now they're using the tools that they have at hand to do so. Next slide. And we're seeing this change as well. So we're actually seeing more traffic coming across our infrastructure starting back in the early March timeframe than we had seen in the past. The queries to basically our DNS sites, which provide navigations instructions, are increasing. And we also see traffic at our European nodes, which you see in Figure 2. We see that traffic going up and increasing significantly starting in early March, and even now it continues to grow. This data is recent as of the end of May, but it's continuing to increase because we know even though some businesses are starting to open up, the world is starting to go back to some level of normalcy. We know that it won't go away anytime soon because patterns have changed, the way people have worked have changed. Next slide, please. And what's interesting is when you look at specific sites on the internet, that you see that their traffic patterns are dramatic increases into the traffic they are seeing. So Figure 3 shows queries to a major online video conferencing site. As you would expect, starting in the early March, when you see lockdowns starting to occur across the world, traffic starts to increase and increases dramatically, changes their business. This interesting increase in traffic, though, sometimes could mask potential attacks that might be going on. But it's things that you have to look at and you have to be aware of, that knowing the change in times, that traffic patterns are changing as well, how will then systems adapt to that? Another great example in Figure 4, when you look at a particular manufacturer of N95 masks, everyone concerned about N95 masks. How good are they? How can they protect me? Why do I need them? Where can I get them? Who makes them? Number of queries to a major manufacturer increased significantly starting in March 15th and has continued to hold steady from that point in time. Next slide, please. When you look at these various verticals then, and try to look at this in aggregate to get an understanding of what might be happening with specific trends. And I know that we're talking DDoS today, but it's important to look at trends that we see around DNS because it helps us drive an understanding of what potentially could be going on and what specific verticals could potentially be at risk. When you look at retail, online retail increasing, streaming, online streaming, over-the-top media increasing, but travel sites going down, dropping. The amount of traffic is actually declining in those locations. These are great indicators because as we see these traffic patterns change, it also changes our perception of what might be going on the internet and how things could be evolving. And so just because we know this data doesn't mean that it's not out there in the public domain. Attackers know this data as well, and attackers leverage this. Because when you see increases in traffic, and typically most of the times when we see that, we think of these as being DDoS attacks. But if you're not overlaying typical increases in traffic or increases in traffic with the change in the environment or the time, you then could potentially misrepresent or misidentify a potential issue that could be going on someone's network or someone's online presence. Next slide, please. So now I'll cover the DDoS attack trends that we've seen, and primarily those that we've seen during this pandemic. And there's some interesting data that we've observed, which is showing that things aren't going away or aren't going to get better anytime soon. The number of attacks that we've seen in previous quarter in Q1 of 2020 was over twice the amount of attacks that we had seen in the prior quarter in Q1 of 2019. And that's a lot of attacks. In volume alone, in this past quarter, we mitigated probably either the third or fourth largest attack ever seen on the internet at 1.12 terabits per second. We have a saying that while the large attacks make headlines, the small attacks make headaches. This is a large attack that makes headlines, but it doesn't mean that all the smaller attacks aren't something you have to worry about as well. It is just an indicator that as much as we hadn't seen a large attack since the 1.7 terabit attack that occurred about 2 years ago, doesn't mean they've gone away. It just means that maybe we're stable or maybe not had a need to go and send such a massive attack out before. And then intensity. The typical attacks we had seen would intend to flood the pipe. So what we are talking about, a volumetric attack, which was really intended to go through and keep others from having access into your online presence. We're now seeing regular attacks where the intensity has increased significantly. And these are the types of attacks that overwhelm the application, not necessarily your bandwidth. And these are very dangerous attacks because even a very small attack can have a high level of intensity, which could in essence take down your applications.
Michael, I have a question for you on that. With regards to these attacks, and it's a disturbing trend that you just illustrated. Could you give us some examples on what type of attacks these are? Are they extortion attempts, or what are you seeing out there?
So great question. We're seeing, it's a variety that you see out there. Typically though, these days, what is interesting is that attackers are not going after, or not attacking an organization for an altruistic purpose. They're really going after it for money. It's, there's someone made a statement, it fails me to remember who made it, but that cybercrime is now the new market economy. And when you think about that, it's true. Today, hackers are going in, or bad actors are really looking for an edge. And so they're looking for a manner in which they could potentially gain access to your system, take you down, go through, maybe steal some data, sell that on the black market. But there's a purpose in mind that is out there. And so we see attacks across the board. But we do see things like, I would say, extortion types of attacks that you had mentioned, where an attacker will come in and they will attack the system on, let's say, yesterday. They come in and they attack the system, and then they send a note to the organization that says, I've just created a DDoS attack against you. Tomorrow I will go through and attack your infrastructure with 10 times the amount that I hit you with today, unless you pay me this certain amount of fee in Bitcoin. We recommend to our customers, don't pay. Because what we found is that most of the times these guys are looking for those types of people or those types of organizations who are concerned and who will say, oh my God, I just came under this massive attack. What do? I guess I have to pay the attacker to not take my business offline. And so then they do. And then they hope that the attacker goes away. The funny thing is the attacker does go away. The attacker goes away if you pay or if you don't pay in most cases. Because Typically, if you pay, they're going to move on to the next guy because they know they've got money from you and now they're going to go and try to extort someone else. But if you don't pay, they realize that, okay, you're not going to pay, and do I even want to waste my time or waste my resources attacking you again to prove a point? No, they're going to move on and they're going to look for the next guy that's out there. So it's an interesting thing when you're seeing patterns that are out there that in the past when someone would do something for a purpose or for a cause, today we're seeing most of them are doing it for money.
Wow, that's just incredible. Thank you for that great explanation, Michael.
Sure, no problem. Continuing on, when we look at the trends, when you look at our Nustar, our Ultra DDoS Protect service, which is our DDoS mitigation platform, year over year, the trends have steadily increased. So as you're looking between 2018 and 2019, outside of a few anomalous weeks where attacks may have gone up, pretty much a steady trend and a steady increase in the number of attacks. But now take a look at 2019. I'm sorry, take a look at 2020. And when you look at when the lockdowns began, somewhere around in the order of week 8 and week 9 in both Europe and the United States, you start to see this trend of regularly increasing attacks that have gone on. And these are continuing. So all the way up to week 16, which would be somewhere in the order of the beginning of May, we continue to still see these attacks, and the number of attacks we're having to mitigate on a weekly basis increase. Next slide, please. And when you look at these numbers between quarters and compare them, when you look at Q4 of 2019 to Q1 of 2020, it's a 13% increase in the number of attacks, going from 2722 to 3075. But when you compare Q1 of 2020 to Q1 of 2019, it's over a 67% increase in attacks, which is a pretty significant increase in attacks in just one quarter. And it's showing that beyond just an increase where you would expect to either see it somewhat stay a little flat, maybe grow at a lower rate, we're seeing a significant trend, a significant change where attackers are taking advantage of the times that they have. They're looking for more vulnerabilities, and in a lot of cases, they're attacking infrastructure that you normally would not protect. So when you think about it, in your organization, with everyone was within your office, you have a number of devices, you have your cloud services protecting that office infrastructure, and your employees can conduct business. Your VPN infrastructure was primarily something that was being used to service those who were on travel or the occasional employee who needed to work from home. It wasn't considered a business critical system until just recently when everyone has had to work from home. Now your VPNs are targets by attackers, and we're seeing that where VPN infrastructure is being primarily targeted by bad actors with an intent to take those infrastructures down or look for a vulnerability or a way to gain a level of access through that. So the things that you were putting in place that you were leveraging to protect your infrastructure as a whole has shifted dramatically and has now caught a lot of cybersecurity professionals in a situation where they're having to find ways to protect the users more so remotely than they were having to do so previously. Next slide, please. And this slide gives a good look at some of the trends that we've seen from March to May, which is really at the height of the pandemic here in the US, and I know as in Europe as well. The number of attacks have increased. We see a 2x increase or a 2 times increase in the number of attacks in the 2-week period from March 1st to March 15th to what we see in May 1st to May 15th. That's a pretty significant change, even though it is a fairly steady trend moving upwards. It's surprising to see it go from over 500 to over 1,000 attacks in that 2-week period. The attack volume continues to increase. So even though we see small attacks that occur, we see lower level attacks. In the April timeframe between the 1st and the 14th is when we saw our 1.12 terabit attack that came across our infrastructure. But then, as I had mentioned, the trends overall showed us that there were a lot more attacks that were happening under 5 gigabits per second. But the intensity was continuing to increase. And the trends show that during this pandemic, attackers are leveraging more intense attacks than they were in the past versus what they were doing before, where they were going volumetric, which tells us that they are targeting specific applications or specific potential vulnerabilities that may be identified. So it's a very interesting trend that we're seeing, which is changing the manner in which we're having to look at DDoS, having to look at protecting our customers and services. Next slide, please. And when we surveyed our NIST respondents, those companies that make up our Neustar Internet Security Council, there was an increase in this past period of those who came under attack. In the past 17 months, only 49% had said that they had suffered or had been on the receiving end of a DDoS attack. That number increased to 65%, 16 points, which is pretty significant in the change. You wouldn't tend to see something over the past 17 months when we look back. You see that staying pretty stable between 49, 50%, where nearly half of the respondents had come under an attack during the previous period. Now we're seeing an increase and a massive jump, which just shows that aligns with all the data we have, but also shows that attackers are coming out in full force and using the pandemic as an opportunity to potentially wage an attack and gain an advantage on you and your infrastructure. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it over to Todd to provide some additional takeaways from this.
Michael, thank you for the great insight on the DDoS situation. I still can't believe DDoS is such a massive disruption after all these years, and it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Let me just run through the key takeaways of Michael's presentation. And by the way, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but again, everyone will be receiving copies of the slides after the webinar. For sure, DDoS is increasing. 100%, 180% increase is a pretty major deal. It's an excellent point. It never went away. People don't talk about DDoS as much now, but it's continually been an attack vector, and it's just going to continue. Attackers are targeting services previously not considered business critical. Great point on protecting DNS. Crucial as nearly all businesses is being transacted online. And some key points, 200% increase in the number of smaller attacks. Attack duration is growing over 3+ days, which I thought was very interesting. And the multiple threat vectors being used is showing just some real sophistication in the attacks coming in. Next slide, please. Again, some more key takeaways here. Any reduction in service quality will drive consumers away. Q4 seeing an increase, and this attack that Michael mentioned, the 1.12 attack, that's just a massive increase. Anyway, some great takeaways from Michael, just a wonderful explanation of the current DDoS landscape. And I am going to hand it over to Nick so he can begin his talk.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, that was really interesting. It's been quite an eye-opener for everybody listening here, which is, as you say, DDoS was something that, blimey, I mean, I've been in information security for 15, 20 years. And, when I first got into this, it was the latest sort of, en vogue, if you like, type of attack. Then it disappeared, or we thought it had disappeared until obviously, the data's telling us something different. And so for my piece here, I suppose there's a couple of points. I'm going to talk about, I suppose, you know, in CRMG, we look at, you know, we're looking very much at how we can help, you know, organizations improve their business, both from a cyber resilience perspective and a cyber risk perspective. And I think that is absolutely vital now. I think that, you know, the nature in which organizations are going to change the way they work, it has a very strong correlation to this type of attack. And I'll just give you a couple of examples that, you know, that spring to mind with a number of clients we work with, especially in the retail sector. You know, a lot of these retailers, they still generate a huge amount of revenue through stores, through their, you know, call centers, help desks, if you like. And, you know, for a lot of these well-established retailers, you know, the .com environment is very important. It's becoming more and more important commercially, but they still drive a huge amount of business through their, you know, through their stores. And of course, you know, because of COVID, that's going to change. Their models change massively. And so the dependency on the .com environment now has just gone through the roof, and probably gone through the roof much quicker than they ever anticipated. So, you know, what that tells me is a greater dependency on, you know, on their .com environment to ensure that they can continue to do business and to continue to provide customers what they want. And that's why it starts to, if you like, magnify the importance of being able to, number one, understand where, you know, those critical components of your .com environment and business are, and look at ways in which, you know, you can help identify the reality of a DDoS attack, what it looks like, what it means to the business, and what good mitigation strategies look like. So, you know, that's just one industry sector. You can think of others, online gaming, you know, that's changed. I think also, you know, let's not forget the OT world. There's increasing, you know, increasing amounts of OT type technology coming online. So, you know, the digital footprint for DDoS attacks is increasing, you know, whether that's oil and gas drilling out there or utilities or whatever it may be. So DDoS attack, I think you know, it's becoming a much more, what you could say, a target-rich environment for this type of attack. But anyway, let me move on to the next slide. So one of the things I wanted to talk about here was this risk-based approach, and I think there's a number of reasons why you know, this risk-based approach is becoming more and more important, especially when you put it in the context of DDoS as well. I think there are a couple of features here. You know, there is an argument here that we need to articulate the potential impact from a DDoS attack up the chain of command, and that's a military term, but it is becoming more and more important. You know, so what does a good sort of risk approach look like? How can we help organizations to be able to articulate the risk as a result of a DDoS attack? Well, I won't go through each of these steps, but these are the types of things that you should at least consider and look out for a good risk-based approach. I think number one is you've got to understand your organization. You know, you've got to understand the dependency you have on the availability of, you know, whether you've got online services, you know, big .com environment, whatever it may be. And then being able to articulate what that could look like in terms of consequences or impact, you know, if you were hit. Because I think the other point to add here, and I know Michael alluded to it, is, you know, consumers' behavior changes very quickly. So if they don't feel they're getting a good quality of service to, you know, an online, you know, product, gaming, whatever it may well be, they'll change very quickly. They know they can get that same product elsewhere. They may have a very short sort of time in terms of being loyal to your organization. And if that changes because they can't get that quality of service, access to the site, slow or delayed response, they will move away. So, you know, it's becoming a business imperative now to ensure that, you know, availability of these types of online services and retailing are there. I think the third and fourth points here, though, is, you know, we've got to get a better handle around, you know, the extent to which we think DDoS is applicable to our organization. It's pretty clear it's a fairly indiscriminate attack type, if you like, but it's also very clear from the data that we've seen that there are increasing numbers of targeted DDoS related attacks. You know, so our role in cybersecurity is to be able to at least provide an objective view of what that threat landscape looks like and what our current capabilities are. You know, and then based on what those current capabilities, decide if more is needed. And when we look at what is needed, it can range from obviously the technical solutions. You know, you should be certainly looking at your, you know, your internet provider and understanding what capabilities that they've got. So it's, you know, you could call that assessing your suppliers, which we know is quite tricky because you don't always get that level of transparency that you may get from within your organization. But ultimately, you know, you have a huge dependency on that internet provider for providing these services. So there should be a level of transparency that gives you that assurance to be able to mitigate against these types of attacks. So, you know, broadly what you see there is it's a process. It's a process that's, you know, best practice, and it's something that all organizations can follow to make a risk-based decision. But let's move on to the next slide, because I think there is a big question that needs to be answered here. And yes, there are lots of solutions out there, lots of good practice that can help prevent these types of attacks. But what happens if one occurs? You know, let's consider that state of compromise. I think that's a really important principle in today's cybersecurity practices. You know, gone are the days where I remember when I first joined information security hundreds of years ago, where, you know, preventative techniques did actually work. You know, you could stop those attacks. But as Michael's highlighted from the Neustar data, you know, threat vectors are increasing in terms of delivering these types of attacks. Level of sophistication is going through the roof. So, you know, it's not looking good out there if you come under the crosshairs of a adversarial attacker for a DDoS attack. So it's necessary to start looking at that resilience plan. And that resilience plan is the ability to be able to continue to drive those operations. You know, is there an alternative? I don't know if there's an alternative provider that you could switch some of your, you know, services to. Are there controls that you know you've got to get in place within the next month and 3 months, whatever level of urgency are needed? But it's not also a bad idea to go through a number of scenario type of attacks, because there will come a point, as anyone who's been through a major cyber attack, whereby, let's be honest, people will, you know, run around like peddlers chickens. There is an issue there whereby decisions need to be made very quickly. And quite often, carrying out these types of scenarios is not a bad idea. It prepares people in terms of being able to respond in a timely and structured manner. So you're limiting the impact. You're not reducing or removing that impact, but you're at least starting to limit it to a more, you know, business level appetite. So there's just a couple of points there, Todd, that I'd like to just highlight from our side.
Thank you for that, Nick. That's some great insight on the DDoS and the way of thinking about the risk with DDoS. Nick and Michael, thank you both for sharing such great insight on the scale of DDoS attacks and how to manage the DDoS risk. We've had some great questions already submitted. If you haven't submitted your questions yet, please do so. I think we've got, yeah, we've got some time to answer some questions. So I've got several here that have already been submitted. So let me start off with the first one here. Which industry sectors need to focus on DDoS more so than before? I think Nick, I'll hand it over to you on this one.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you know, I think certainly it's pretty much any organization that has a, you know, a high dependency on their, you know, on their online environment. And I'm thinking here, you know, this could be, you know, it's really interesting looking at those charts that show the level of traffic, you know, so the streaming services that are provided. You know, I'd even sort of imagine that you've got your news, online news outlets, media outlets, because there is this fascination around COVID, you know, for the right reasons. You know, we want to understand, you know, what's going on in your local area, because, you know, naturally humans are making effectively risk-based decisions on their health. So there's a lot of information out there that, you know, that us as individuals are trying to get access to help us make informed decisions around, you know, the risks as a result of COVID. You know, as I mentioned before, there's the obvious one, the retailers. You know, we're all shopping online more so than ever before. And as I say, you know, a lot of organizations that have stores, they're closed. You know, stores will start to slowly open, but the dependency and demand now for online services is huge. I think there's you know, there are a couple of other sort of sectors that I can imagine, but I don't think this has necessarily changed as a result of what we're talking about in terms of COVID. We're seeing, you know, a number of our clients, as I say, working in maybe the mining, the oil and gas, largely where there's a high dependency on OT, operating technology, that's now, you know, a number of years recently has been connected to the internet. And again, you know, these are technology types that provide services that cannot go down. They just have to be available. I mean, not talking 99.999, talking 100% of the time. So, you know, there's a big level of exposure, a big level of impact or potential impact if these get hit by DDoS. So I don't think any sector's not exposed to these types of attacks, but I do think there are a few in mind that are very exposed or potentially exposed anyway.
Excellent, Nick. Thank you for that. We got another, this is a great question. How can a DDoS solution distinguish between a legitimate user and the attackers? I think Michael will be the best for this one.
That is a really good question. And the funny thing is it's difficult. It's very hard. Most attackers are going to leverage botnets. Which could look as if it's coming from a legitimate computer, a legitimate server, a legitimate person that you've seen before. It's a lot of times what we recommend to our customers is profile the traffic, profile what you see on a normal basis. And then after that, anything that changes is considered anomalous. Treat as cautionary and potentially an attack. The other thing that we look at as well is you potentially, when you go and move into application layer security, you can put in front of these things like challenges, we call them. So Java type of challenges or CAPTCHAs that bots typically aren't programmed to address, which then allows organizations to identify like who's human and who is not, because they've completed the challenge, and then you can go through and whitelist those IP addresses from where they're coming from. But it's really interesting because given the very prolific nature of botnets that we see today, coming from IoT devices, from popped computers, and now more and more people working from home, where now they're surfing to various sites online, it's extremely difficult to make a determination of who is a legitimate user and who is an attacker, short of looking at the behavior of what that person is doing and then making an assessment, has their profile changed from where they were the day prior?
I think that the behavioral part, Michael, is you're right on the money with that. Yeah, great answer for that. Let's go on to our next question. How could you quantify the impact of a DDoS to make the effects of a DDoS attack business relevant? I think I'll hand this over to you, Nick.
Oh, gee, thanks. Wow, okay. I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. That's a pretty big question too. I think, okay, so, and this is a really valid one, because we know that there are, there are questions that your traditional cyber risk approach, cyber risk assessments can answer, and there are some that can't. One of them is being able to quantify the risk. But if you're using some kind of quantitative risk approach, well, that becomes easier. And actually, when I think about DDoS, I think actually this may be one where in certain areas, certain services, you could quantify, and you could quantify it with a high level or high degree of confidence. So let me give you an example. Again, let's use you could use settlement systems in a bank, or you could use, knocking out your .com environment for a retailer, a medical provider, whatever it may be. You know, these are services and systems that you can measure fairly accurately. You know, the amount of revenue that's being generated. Let's say, for example, you know, a retailing website. 3 weeks before Christmas, you know, or any seasonal part of the year, then you're going to experience typically your highest, you know, run through of revenue and acquisitions that are going on. So, you know, if you take the worst case scenario and you say, right, if we suffer a DDoS attack, and we're, you know, as Michael highlights, some of these attacks are now, you know, they're occurring over 3 days, you know, 72 hours during your peak trading. That's a really ugly picture that's going to be generated. But you can start to use that information. You could start to say, look, worst case scenario, we get knocked out for 48 hours during our peak time of the year for trading. This is the direct financial impact, you know, the primary impact, if you like. You could then start looking at all those secondary impacts that leads to that, such as, you know, your cost of immediate resources that needed. Maybe you need to, you know, make some claims around your cybersecurity insurance if you've got it. There are all of those factors that can come into play. I think the key point here is that you can start to quantify the effects of a DDoS attack for certain areas of the business.
That was really interesting, Nick. Thanks for that great answer. It definitely gave me just a different perspective of thinking how these attacks, or how to think about the risk with these attacks. Here's a question, I think, over to you, Michael. DDoS attacks have been around for a long time and seem to be getting worse. How do you think DDoS attacks are going to evolve?
Interesting thing about what we're seeing in DDoS attacks is it's funny. Conversation we had with another organization was that really like smaller attacks that are targeting, or surgical type of attacks that are targeting specific points of infrastructure applications, why are we still calling them DDoS attacks? Because DDoS has had this moniker that it's been always associated with this large volumetric type of attack that, you know, was intended to be, you know, make the headlines. It's still a denial of service attack, you know, in its true form, in its base form, regardless of if it's distributed or not. So however you choose to deny the service, it still gets classified as such. What we're seeing, and where I think we're going to see trends going much more in the future, is that attackers are becoming a lot more particular, or as I said in the past, surgical about the manner in which they're conducting attacks and what they're attacking. They have figured out that if they exploit a very specific vulnerability or target a specific application, you know, I think as Nick was mentioning, you go through the fulfillment component of a service. So you look for the payment services, or you try to overwhelm the certificate base that validates or strips off the SSL layer. You start looking at various pieces. They start looking at various pieces of application that they believe could potentially be the weakest, and then attack that. And so I think over time, where we're going to see these attacks evolve, we're going to start seeing more and more complex attacks that are going to require organizations to migrate into more of a, you know, web application firewalls, start taking advantage of bot management tools that are out there, so you know who is on the other end of the connection, be able to discern good versus bad, human versus bot, and all the combinations associated with that. And we're going to start seeing that more evolution into an increase in an intent to push towards API security, where you start looking at, you know, when you start thinking about things like credential stuffing, or dictionary types of attacks, that those are becoming more and more prevalent, or becoming more and more important to be able to mitigate.
Just a follow-up question on this. Are you seeing, especially with the API side, supply chains being impacted by this?
Not yet, but we are seeing customers come more and more to us and expanding the areas that they want to be protected by DDoS. It goes back to some of the trends I had mentioned prior. Business before was being run in a certain manner, And now with the pandemic, they're seeing that they have to change the way they're doing business, and they have to protect other areas of their systems. I think it all goes back to organizations have started to take a deeper look at figuring out is what is important to them and what is important to what is the specific things that are important to their business. And now we're starting to focus their attention on protecting that, as opposed to just doing what traditionally everyone else in the industry has done before. Let's protect my online presence. Let's protect all the things that everyone else will be looking at. They've now started to take deeper focus into what is important to me and what would an attacker consider important or valuable even. And let's start protecting that.
Got it. Thank you for that, Michael. Great. Just another question here. Obviously, the COVID thing, I think you both touched upon the COVID side, but the risk of DDoS is obviously increasing with COVID. Is there anything else that DDoS can be disrupting in the COVID world? Any other insights either of you would like to add with that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start this one off anyway. I think there are a couple of things around the whole sort of DDoS and linking it to COVID. I think, you know, we've seen from the data that Nustar provided, we're effectively looking at the first 100 meters of a marathon with this. I don't think this is an attack that is going to go away, and I certainly don't think it's going to go away based on the fact that availability and dependency on available technology, now we're working at home, or at least we'll have different working methods, is becoming the norm. I think it's also fair to sort of, you know, for us to sort of take a step back and realize that, you know, every so often you get these spikes in terms of different attacks. You know, if I think back a couple of years ago, you know, if I said the word ransomware, we'd all say, yep, that was the latest flavor of the year. And DDoS, you know, certainly, given the way we're working, certainly looks like, you know, the new kid on the block. But I think just to answer your point here, or the question here, Todd, how should we look at the risk of DDoS in the COVID world? I think we have to become very clear about the types of technology and the dependency on those. I think one of the fascinating statistics that Michael highlighted here is, you know, the increasing number of those types of attacks that tend to dip below the radar, you know, less than 5 gigabits, I think it was, but also the intensity of those types of attacks that can knock out key applications, you know, your webinar technologies, you know, whatever type of technologies you're using to work from home, work remotely. So I think that, you know, organizations with the risk profile and the focus on risk is going to shift quite quickly to the availability aspects.
Great point on the availability aspect, Nick. Anything on your side to add, Michael?
No, I think that pretty much summed it up. I agree with all the points that are there. I think now is the time to look at what are the most vulnerable points of your infrastructure and figure out how you got to protect them.
All right, fair enough. Guys, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Nick and Michael, I want to thank you both for sharing great insight on your huge wealth of experience on DDoS. I learned a lot during this webinar, and I'm sure anyone who was attending this webinar also learned a lot as well. Again, for everyone listening, recording and the slides will be sent out afterwards in the next several days. And again, thank you for everyone for attending. That'll be it for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.